Pirate Wizard Dragon here. Story that I wrote called Brother Story. It's a true story. My last visit to my family. 2 weeks ago, I went through a very scary situation with my immediate family. My brother wanted to beat me to a bloody pulp and may have actually killed me if I did not leave the situation. I thought I would be able to write about it after a week, and even now, 2 weeks later, it is not easy, but my emotions are better balanced so I can write with a little more clear perspective. I've had a very difficult relationship with my parents and brother for many various complex reasons. There's been more than one time where I've completely had to remove myself from my family by moving to a different state or just not talking to them for extended periods of my life. It was not until my mid 30s that I truly comprehended that my family was toxic. It is hard when all you know is a certain pattern of behavior and until you witness a different, more positive way of behaving and conducting oneself. I have my wife to thank for this. I have often said in the last 7 years that my wife's mother treats me much better than my own. And I do not mean to say that my parents were completely horrible. They tried and did better than their own parents in many ways. The tools they were given in many ways were not sufficient. I do not think they intended to psychologically damage me as much as they did, but they did. Physically, emotionally, and down to my soul. That's the problem with memories or pain from those that love us. It is a double-edged sword when you are a child. There is the initial shock of the physical pain, but the residual confusion and dichotomy of this person who is supposed to protect and love me is now making me suffer. These memories stick to one's soul. For me, they make me feel so heavy sometimes. The pain of childhood torture has definitely led to my PTSD and other diagnoses. These are painful memories and are the main reason I'm writing these stories. I'm hoping by sharing some of this, it will help lighten my load. Like the last thing, hopefully after almost a decade of therapy and thinking about these memories, will be my feeble attempt to justify the sadness I have on tap that will never seemingly leave me. The pain seems tattooed to my inner bones, and time doesn't quite laser it away as I would have hoped. I think we all think at some point we will get to a state of adulthood where childhood crap doesn't affect us consciously. But back to my last visit. Just a forewarning, my brain jumps tracks a lot, and telling a story for me sometimes involves several backstories to fully understand the context of the current story and situation in its complexity. I actually believe I remember the first time I saw my little brother. I remember it being very late. I was only 3. It was one of my very first memories. My mother came home into the house and turned on the inner hallway light to illuminate her path. I was supposed to be sleeping, but hearing the commotion made me curious. I saw my mother holding a package of some squirming living creature bundled in a brown cover. I knew without a doubt that what she held in her arms would change everything. I actually had a older half brother. His name was slash is Chad. I was told until I was a teenager that my was told until I was a teenager that my mother gave Chad back to his father in a mutually agreed upon decision. I remember playing with a rubber king Kong in the backyard with him. These are some of my earliest memories before the age of 3. It was not until I was older that my mother confessed to me my father forced her to give him up for adoption. And after I was born, because on one more occasion my father had found Chad trying to choke me or suffocate me to death. I have a weird, reoccurring theme in my life of being choked or suffocated, and I often wonder if there are suppressed memories that I still have not confronted, but subconsciously still affect me in ways I do not know. I did not used to believe in repressed memories, but then my wife recorded me the first year we were together after I had drunk way too much strong German beer at a Christmas party at her parents'. She recorded me later on that night with her phone, a definite blackout drunk session, where I retold a story about literal torture I'd completely forgotten about from when I was a child. I will go into this more, but it doesn't weigh into the point of this story, only in that it proved to me repressed, painful memories do still affect us as adults, even when consciously we think we are beyond them and they do not affect us anymore or they don't exist. Everybody in my family suffers from multiple diagnosable mental illnesses. I am just the only one who went through the grinder of the mental illness system in the 1990s to get a diagnosis and attempt treatment. My mother had horrible alcoholic parents. She watched them chase each other with knives and try to kill on each other as a child. My mom's mother died when she was just a little girl from drinking. My mom was put into foster homes, and a whole book could be written just about her. I was a voracious reader as a child and very nosy and curious, and found my mother's high school journals and read them all. A lot of it did not make sense until I was older, but the theme was apparent. People could be cruel. My mom also wrote about being raped by 6 Navy soldiers in her diary. She had a broken childhood and it still affects her to this day. She really still feels a sense of extreme guilt for giving up my older half brother and has always openly thought and said it was my father's doing and she had no choice. At the time he gave her ultimatum of her giving up my older half brother, he would take me and leave. My family has mastered the use of ultimatums and threats. We generally function off emotional blackmail or guilt or a weird sense of family obligation that has spurred us to do what each other wants. My father's family also has a long, twisted tale of abandonment and pain and abuse. These things happen in sometimes unbreakable chains. Even now, I know as a self-aware 45-year-old that if by chance there is an almost end, there is a 0% chance that I become a father, I too would not be able to break the programming of pain and abuse instilled into me as a central operating system. I would hope I would be able to, but honestly I know it would be hard. I helped raise a kid once from the age of 3 to 6, and it was incredibly hard, and even though I tried, I know I scared that kid once too many times, just yelling and being a scaring adult, without even trying or laying hands on him. My father was abandoned at a litter orphanage when he was a child along with his 2 brothers and little sisters. It was a bit of time before his incredibly abusive grandmother, Sal, took him out of the orphanage and ruled him and his siblings with an iron fist. She was a fiery red-headed woman who was feared by many. She literally drank and fought and beat him and his brothers regularly. My parents abandoned reality in the 1980s to become fundamentalist Christians. They did this as a reaction to the exuberant craziness of the late 70s culture and society's shift into modern living. My parents desperately wanted to have a higher purpose and believe after so much chaos and unexplainable, they just wanted some black and white in their lives. Religion does this nicely. Everything is nicely divided into 2 camps, good, evil, God, devil, heaven, hell, etc. No need for grays. Nothing is gray when dealing with the totality of one's soul and in which eternal abode it shall rest. Either you're going to the pearly gates with golden roads and a custom-built mansion with your bejeweled crown, the amount of gems directly reflected your ability to have converted other souls to your religion, or it's hellfire and eternal torture in a room of loneliness, solitude, and you in variously grisly ways being tortured by Beelzebub. They also, because of their past, desperately wanted to be part of a family that was safe and welcoming. On the surface, many churches provide a sort of family and community that people, especially broken people, desire. I have a lot more to say about this subject, but I will try not to get sidetracked. I actually detest most organized religions and think they are directly responsible for a lot of the pain, hate, and suffering in the world, but I digress. My younger brother, so many conflicting emotions and feelings about him. We as children moved a lot. The thing about moving a lot as a child is trying to fit into a new town or school as a child is difficult. We moved to Oregon when I was just getting into the first grade. We went back to San Diego, my birth city, less than a year later. We left San Diego when I was in the 2nd grade for a small town in southeastern Colorado called Swink. I remember the first few weeks at that place. We did not have a functioning bathroom facilities, and I remember my dad teaching me to use a bucket lined with a bag in the backyard and how to place dirt on top of it after you were done. Funny the things you remember as a kid. Then a few months later to Ordway, then shortly after moving to La Junta, Colorado. I spent the 3rd grade until the 6th grade there. We left La Junta for Tucson, and I lived there for a year or so. We went back to San Diego, and I spent the last year of junior high in Lemon Grove Middle School. We lived in several places and situations along the way. I remember when we first left for Colorado, living in my dad's van, all 4 of us for weeks on end in Colorado at a KOA campground until my dad could find a church to help him with work. My father's a house painter. So was his dad and his granddad. I am technically a 4th-generation house painter. But even though I was trained, I never pursued it seriously like my little brother. Funny, I still call him my little brother. He has been bigger than me since my freshman year in high school. He is 6'1" tall, depending on the slouch. He has easily 2.5 inches on me. He used to outweigh me by a good 20 to 30 pounds, but since my late 30s, I've caught up to his 200 pounds just by the nature of my metabolism slowing down drastically. The reason I bring up moving a lot is that having a younger little brother was nice as a kid when we moved around a lot. In the fact that I always had at least one other kid to play with and kind of be my friend. I loved my brother a lot as a kid. We were completely opposite in a lot of ways. My parents have often retold the story how funny it was the first time I fell out of the crib as a baby and hit my head and how I never tried to escape again, compared to the half-dozen times my brother literally destroyed his crib escaping. They also used to tell how Travis would cry incessantly when he was not in his own bed, and as a baby would throw his bottle as hard as he could away from the crib, and it would hit the wall when he realized it was empty. My mother said I was such a good baby, comparatively, I was told. My parents started experimenting with religion before we left San Diego. I was about 5 when my parents determined that television was an unwholesome man-made creation of evil influence, not edifying to our pristine, innocent souls, and needed to be removed from the house. It also did not help that my 3-year-old brother would do his best Lou Ferrigno Hulk impression after watching the Hulk on television. He would go into the kitchen and destroy stuff and break dishes. He was a little monster even then. I requested that my dad build me a bookshelf when I was about 10 or so I could properly keep my Centurion action figures and G.I. Joes displayed and organized in the proper regiments and teams. I folded my clothes and oftentimes planned my next day's or few days' outfits much in advance. My parents often sent me to my room as a child, not always as punishment, sometimes just to be out of the way while they did their adult stuff. In La Junta, I had my own room. At some point, I did not have my own room and had to share. At some points, I did not have my own room and had to share with my brother. When we moved back to San Diego, we had to share a room my freshman year, and this led to problems. I loved my room as a child. It was my sanctuary. My brother's room was always a royal mess, dirty socks and broken toys. I never liked letting my brother play with my toys. He had an amazing ability to destroy almost anything within minutes of touching it. I was also awkward at sports and socializing in general. Every summer as a child, I spent time in little leagues. I never really wanted to. It was just the way it was. Bible camps, bowling leagues, tennis lessons. These are the things my parents did to keep us busy during the summer. My brother excelled at such sporting activities. I personally think the biggest reason I do not like sports is because I wore spectacles. I never liked, nor do I like, objects flying at my face at high speeds, or any speeds for that matter. I never liked physical competition. I knew my strengths even as a child. There was a reason I won the first chess championship in the 3rd grade I entered. I like words and strategy. These are where I excelled and had strengths. My brother loved sports, and he was good at them. I spent a lot of time in left field praying no one would hit one my way. I struck out a lot. There was one time, though, probably from sheer luck, where I hit a triple and remember having the third base coach wave to keep me running to the third. I remember him coming up to me and telling me he just knew I was going to hit it, just by the glint in my eye. Maybe I'd finally had enough that day. I also always got the Most Improved Player award every summer, kind of like the award they gave to kids who just were not that good, so they did not feel bad that they did not get an award like everyone else. Here's a you don't suck as bad as when you started at least award. It was okay. I kind of got used to it, and I enjoyed it, honestly. Lots of time to think when one is sitting on the bench or hanging out in left field. My little brother, on the other hand, won real awards with little golden baseball guys holding a bat. My brother was not always a bad guy. When he was younger, he did occasionally display traits of good and kind-souledness. He loved animals, and when he was in elementary school, he started learning sign language and wanted to help people who had developmental disabilities. He adopted this older homeless black guy who lived in an alley when he was first in junior high, and he used to bring him cigarettes and food, and got to know him. He was not very materialistic in many ways, like my father. He did not care about having stuff as much as when he had money, securing what was needed to throw a party or cook a meal. He used to, even as an adult, feed about 40% of the homeless stoners in his kitchen and porch the first couple of weeks whenever his food stamps money came through. He'd be grilling and chilling with all the homies who were broke. But this was not always good because good time friends were often nowhere to be found the last week of the month when things were tight. My brother also used to unquestionably defend me whenever other people were cruel with their words. One time we were in a bar and some jerk looked at me and said, "What the fuck do you have tattooed on your face? It looks like a blob of shit." I did not react at all. I used to have an opal stone tattooed on my forehead, right in the middle. I had it covered with an Eastern dragon head. It was hard for people to tell what it was, and more than once I got confused looks from people. I still do. I usually am quite befuddled when somebody actually insults me in public, and it's not till about 48 hours later, after replaying such incidents in a torturous, never-ending loop at least 340 times in my head, that I actually come up with a witty comeback. This guy had no idea who I was. This guy had no idea I was with the large-bearded Viking sitting 2 chairs at the bar down from him. But he figured out pretty quickly when my brother very loudly said, "What the fuck is that on your face? A pussy hole? 'Cause you look like a pussy." The guy did not know what to say and just slowly faded away to the crowd in the bar. Our family is weird like that. We can be absolutely cruel to one another, but if anyone outside our family diminishes or insults us, one of us in the other's presence, there is hell to pay. We definitely were much closer at a certain times, and I always thought that the chaos as children and moving had made us closer and more friends than typical brothers. My brother had a big heart as a child, but my parents, the world, and his poor choices resulted in his dreams being so slowly compromised until the skeleton of what they were not able to hold the viable reality of those dreams if they manifested in reality. I wish my brother would have tried a little harder to keep pushing for his dreams. All he wanted for the most of his college was to pursue a dream in environmentalism and protect endangered species like wolves. He really wanted to study wolves and loves those creatures like I love dragons. In many ways, my brother definitely is a Gemini, has taught me the dualism of that sign in a very personal way. Before my brother was married, we were a lot closer, and I believe he held my counsel in higher esteem. So I should probably mention at this point I'm somewhat psychic. So I know this sounds like a completely ridiculous statement to say without proof. I promise I will bring all of these threads back together in regards to my brother and how this all connects to my last visit with my brother. Please be patient with how I tell this story. So when I say I'm psychic, I feel the need to explain why I think it is possible. First of all, a lot of so-called mystic, psychic, mediums, occultists, and assorted similar types do not actually have to have any psychic ability to be an actual psychic. I know on the surface this seems like a contradictory statement, but it is not. Many of these people are just extremely perceptive and top-notch natural psychologists. They just know how to filter reality to a point of great observation without all the layers, programming, or distractions that plagues most people from seeing actually what is right in front of them. Some people don't need tools for this, some do. I call those who do not need tools to practice these abilities empty-handed magicians. I am not this type of magician, nor psychic, unless I absolutely need to be. It is harder for me. I actually trained for a while with a school in Boulder called the Psychic Institute. It was pretty interesting. The lady that ran it sure figured out how to fill a niche in that county for sure. She was very savvy. I had issues with some of the gender-specific abilities they said were only accessible to certain genders, and also recognized it for the pyramid pay-to-play at a higher level scam/scheme it was pretty on. It basically was a repackaged, remarketed school of esoteric and magical concepts that had been rewritten in a language less triggering to those programmed to favor certain words and concepts and presented in a whole new way, much more approachable way. It was genius in a way. She had people paying at the second level to do phone psychic work for her. I mean, a whole team of young, sultry-sounding 20-year-olds freshly woke college, mostly girls. She also set it up as a church and did weekly healing meditations services to avoid taxes. I attended a few and took her first 2-tier classes to check it out. I mention this also in evidence to my inherent psychic ability that happened there one time in particular. Okay, another short story to properly background the story I'm distracted on. I have facial tattoos. Not like prison gangster facial tattoos. I don't like crazy words or rapper ice cream cones or such. When I was young, there was a guy named Luke who worked at the coffee shop downtown in San Diego in the base of a huge skyscraper hotel building. It was pretty huge coffee shop, and when it first opened, it had a CD and record store that was connected inside the middle of it like an island. It was the second coolest coffee shop in the 90s downtown in San Diego after Old Vienna's. The coffee shop, was one big theatrical room for posing with pool tables and attracted goths, punks, downtown folk, ravers, and the usual mix of diversity and pretty much any cool place in San Diego. And the usual mix of diversity that pretty much any cool place in San Diego did at that time. Luke worked there. He was the first guy in real life I'd ever seen with a face tattoo. He had a black tribal chin tattoo and the Star Wars Rebel symbol tattooed on his arm. This was probably around 1994. I found everything about him appealing. He was the most counterculture person I had seen at that moment. He played in a band, and one time I gave him huge harmonicas I had taken out of an accordion I dismantled. When things were bustling, he was calm. When things were calm, he was bustling. He was just different and free in a way I aspired to. I had up to that point only tattooed Morpheus from DC comic books written by Neil Gaiman and the scorpion that King Mob had on his back from DC Vertigo comics, The Invisibles, written by Grant Morrison, in the same place the fictional character had on his back. My first 2 tattoos were an homage to my favorite 2 comics. Tattoos were to become a much bigger part of my life than I ever knew at that particular time in my early 20s. I had a high school history teacher who saw my skill as an artist, and before my sophomore year was done in high school, I could be found on many beautiful, sunny California days in a dark, messy, unsanitary garage of such said teacher, trying to figure out how to navigate his rudimentary tattoo setup and putting designs on myself. My first tattoo was done by my teacher before I was of legal age. I had been observing this teacher for more than a few hours actually tattooing, and he had inquired in a very male, toxic way as to when I was to step up and get some ink. The first time I observed the process, I was horrified. I never could imagine myself doing this willfully, or even for a second imagine I would be tattooing down the road for almost a decade professionally. I eventually warmed up to the idea once I saw this particular pose in the Sandman comic of Dream with his hands to the side and almost like a half-formed prayer pose. I knew it would go on my body. Plus, I loved the idea of having the Lord of Dreams being my first tattoo. I showed my design to my history teacher and the tattoo mentor, and we went through the process of getting ready to tattoo it by making a stencil by hand. He was not a trained professional and would have been considered a scratcher, but he tried very hard. I'll write more about this particular mentor. He actually played a pretty big formative part in my life and has been a great inspiration to me. We definitely have had our difficulties, but I am proud to still call him my friend and mentor almost 25 years later. He started to do the tattoo and about 10 minutes into it, and after barely 20 He started to do the tattoo about 10 minutes into it, and after barely 20% of the outline was done, handed me the machine and said, "You know what to do." So my first tattoo I received was kind of the first tattoo I did. I mentioned the tattoos in relation to the Boulder Psych Institute. I found them by sheer fate on Halloween 2016. I was dressed as Jared Leto, Joker from the movie Suicide Squad. I actually paid a professional to come to my house and cover my face and makeup to make me look like I had no facial tattoos at all, so we could repaint it white and do fake tattoos to emulate the Joker from this movie. Anyways, after school, I was attending Front Range Community College at the time, getting a 4.0, and was president of the Student Government Association. Little did I know, less than a month later, I'd be expelled for standing up to an overly aggressive security guard and basically railroaded into a bunch of horseshit that still residually makes me a little angry. But that's another chapter I've already actually written, because at this point in my life, I had started to recognize when the dogs of certain types of culture and perspective wars had been unleashed, or at least starved to the point of desperately gnawing on their chains. I recognized their howls and documented everything that happened in that situation. But I digress a lot. Anyways, I was there in Boulder, Colorado, dressed as the Joker, and there was a Halloween festival going on. There was a tent that said free psychic reading, and a pretty hippie-looking Boulder girls trying to get people to sit at very organized in rows of 4x4 in the tent and do a reading. I was down. This girl led me into the tent and did a reading for me after closing her eyes and waving her hands in a rhythmic pattern over my head in distance and reading my aura, etc. It was honestly the most accurate reading I've ever had next to an astrology chart a person in the same city did for me many years earlier. The person who did my chart was able to determine I left home due to not my own decision when I was 15, because of the conjunction of a certain planets that aligned that year in a particular way. Tarot cards and astrology definitely work in my experience, just like baking a cake. Just have to make sure you got the right measurements and ingredients, and you'll get a cake or at least some muffins. Don't knock it till you've tried it. The reason I mentioned my facial tattoos is that I was excited to get a reading where a person doing the reading could not tell if my tattoos were real or part of a Halloween costume. I felt this would help, and was even more surprised when the reader closed her eyes. And as I have stated, I am an intuitive psychic, but the tool I use to trigger these gifts is tarot. I've been reading tarot since high school, and I've done many metaphysical fairs and stores as a reader to hone my skills over the years. So I was super impressed by the ability of this reader to do an accurate reading with her mind and with only her mind and her fillers. I have had many poor readings from tarot readers who spent more time looking at the 40 plus hours of tattoo work I have from the neck up on my head and face than actually reading the cards they dealt out. I've also had doctors do similar, so I don't blame them. I do have a distracting face. She had me sold, this open-handed reader, at this Halloween Boulder Festival. I knew I'd be looking into the Boulder Psyche Institute later, so I took her pamphlet and crammed it into my pocket to be disseminated later. So, several months later, after attending 2 different classes and forking over several $100 and gaining all I could from the BPI, Boulder Psychic Institute, people, they invited me to their annual Christmas party. The reason I bring this up is they had a white elephant gift exchange. After I was the only one who successfully was able to use my psychic abilities to name exactly what was in 2 presents. A pink crystal and a black-covered book is what I saw in my mind's eye. I realized I was probably the only one there with any actual psychic ability. I believe my psychic abilities were formed out of necessity of being in very scary situations and having to survive being able to read the current of energy of the room or people I was dealing with. So back to my brother. The reason I mentioned my psychic abilities in regards to my brother is this ability has not been a blessing, and there is sometimes something to the saying, a prophet is never accepted in his own country. The first evidence of such proposed seemingly unreal abilities to see through the void and know what is around the bend came when I was very young, driving around with my younger brother in Spring Valley, California, in his tiny yellow Honda Civic. We pulled up to a stoplight, and there was a gas station. This girl, who was more my age than my brother's age, came up to the passenger's window from the sidewalk next to the car. We were on a hill of sorts. I had met her once before at Donnie's trailer park. I don't have time to get into that place right now, but I look forward to writing about it, and you will not believe the stories I have to tell about that place. It was obvious to me she did not want to talk to me. Her name was Chastity, and she was tall like my brother, and she had very long straight brown hair. Her teeth back then were really messed up and crooked, but despite that, she was fairly attractive. Time was not kind to her or my brother when it comes to superficial beauty. She was looking at my brother like some circling vulture with a similar hunger in her eye, and even though my brother had met her less than 3 times at that point, I just knew. I told him with a little cavalier attitude in my voice that my brother is the type of girl you will marry. And several years later he did. This was the first time with my brother I remember having a premonition. I wish it had been my last. My brother moved to Nederland, Colorado in 2002. I left San Diego, California right after 9/11 because I was living in Spring Valley, California, and just sick of my life at the time. California can be a mixed bag. I was a bit paranoid as a person, and the fact that the news was reporting that 7 of the 9 hijackers that hit the Twin Towers were set up less than a mile from my house did not help me want to stay. I also was just sick of hanging out with Jonesers all the time. I say Jonesers because my brother and his friends were pretty much my only friends, and they were 100% stoners and spent half the time just calling over and over different drug dealers trying to score weed. I smoked weed and definitely can attest to its powerful addictive qualities. The only reason I do not smoke weed very much right now is the fact of the draconian laws here in the state of Kansas where I live. Plus, it's good for my lungs to take a break every once in a while. I drive back to Colorado often enough to scratch that itch. But back then, many days consisted of just hanging out with my brother and at that time his girlfriend Chastity in my parents' house backyard, sometimes in Spring Valley, in their 15-foot Class C motorhome that was parked in my folks' backyard. My parents kicked me out of the house years earlier when I was 15 when we lived in La Mesa, California. The reason I mention this is they rationalized kicking me out of the house when I had completely flipped out after my mom went into my room and threw out all my comic books because she was completely convinced I was bringing demons into the house that were attached to comics that I brought in. This really pissed me off because I pretty much spent all my work earnings from the 2 different jobs I held as a freshman on first appearances and #1 issues. And even to this day, I am a little bitter about it. Many of those comics and first appearances later on were blockbuster movie hits. I had impeccable geek taste and was way ahead of the curve on what would be mega cool and over-commercialized way before it did. And probably could have sold those comics at this point and funded a lavish European or Australian vacation. The reason I mention this is my parents created a loophole that allowed my brother to fornicate and listen to overtly occultic metal bands and wear Vic Rattlehead Megadeth t-shirts that actually portrayed demons dragging poor old Vic down to hell in a graphic way. This was all okay because technically he was not bringing it into their home, and he was giving them like $50 a month for the dirt in the backyard. They're okay with bringing mystical, invisible, ethereal demons into the backyard, just not in the house. I decided to leave San Diego at that time in the spring of 2002. When I was 25, I had hitchhiked to Rhode Island several years before on a whim with my punker attitude and a bag of some saltines. It was after that particular day I had waited for my brother and his circus friends to hook up some weed so we all could get high and go see the new Spider-Man movie. We ended up missing the movie because Lord knows you can't even take a dump unless you're high, much less sorry. We ended up missing the movie because Lord knows you can't enjoy even taking a dump unless you're high, much less a blockbuster awesome superhero movie. I was just sick of it all. I burned my punk rock jacket, my leather punk rock jacket at a fire pit in Ocean Beach in a symbolic phoenix sort of way, reduced all my belongings to 2 bags I could lift up and carry with both hands, bought a new dark olive green leather jacket with a leather hood I was fond of, threw a dart at a map, and bought a Greyhound ticket. I ended up in Fargo, North Dakota for a weird spell and ended up less than a year later in Nederland, Colorado, because my brother had told me I would love it. I have a special kind of hate for Nederland, Colorado. My whole family would have been much better off if my brother would have moved anywhere else on the earth, I suspect. There are 3 distinct times I tried to warn my brother of premonitions I had of a serious nature that were unwarranted or ignored. Some of these were some of these were just silly, others life altering for many involved. The first one involves my brother's 3rd child, the power of tarot. All these are true stories. It may be unbelievable, but they are true. One night on New Year's Eve, my brother requested I keep watch on his 2 kids that were asleep while he and his wife Chastity went out to party and drink at the local bar in the Pioneer Inn. I was okay with this because my New Year's Eve ritual 4 years involved doing my yearly tarot readings for myself and thinking about sorry, I lost my place. Years later, and thinking about possible avenues of adventures and goals for the upcoming year. Back then, I did not really know the etiquette of getting permission from someone you knew before doing a tarot reading on them. Years later, I would learn there were different kinds of rules in regards to using divination, just out of respect and balance. But my brother wouldn't have cared anyways. If I asked him, he probably would have just laughed and said sure. I don't remember the reading I did for myself that year, but I do remember reading I did on how things would go for my brother in the upcoming year. The Emperor card in my Vertigo deck came up in a very auspicious way, and I remember that evening telling my brother in the kitchen while we smoked a joint that he better wrap it up unless he wanted to become a father for the 3rd time. He laughed at me when I told him the cards told me this. I have had this happen several times in my life where I've told people the cards have laid out possibilities and have had them laugh at me only to see them turn a shade paler months later when I reminded them. 3 months or so later, he and his wife called me in the kitchen because they had some important news to tell me. I told my brother if it was about the pregnancy, I already knew, and reminded him of the New Year's Eve conversation he had forgotten. He was a little shocked because he had not remembered until that moment being disregarded as an impossibility in his mind, I'm sure, when he first heard it. Years before any of my brother's kids were born, my brother called me to meet with him in Boulder, Colorado. We drank like pirates for a few hours on the back patio at this bar called Connor O'Neill's. It's now been closed. My brother and I had some really good times drinking and carrying on like fools when we were younger, sometimes. My younger brother was a Viking reincarnate. And when the 2 of us hung out together, most smart people gave us a wide girth of space unless they were stupid or pretty enough to sue the beast. That particular night was one of the first nights I remember using Jedi powers to get us out of the clinker. It was after a few hours drinking, my brother confessed to me he was about to father a child and wanted to tell me to celebrate. We definitely did. But I had already learned the hard way a few times that if me and my brother drank together, that I should always stay a little more sober and pace myself, because inevitably things could get crazy, scary, violent, or all 3. This would be one of those nights. After a few different stops on Pearl Street, we headed to the hill because a show was going on that we had heard about and we had been invited to. We did not realize it was graduation weekend and how crazy the university district would be. The venue was the Fox Theater. The band was a hip-hop Eminem-like guy who was rapping. My brother had a bad habit of heckling musicians when he was drunk, and it almost got him killed years later. That night, he pushed his way through hundreds of college students to get right up to the front of the stage. There was a large metal bar that was about 6 inches above your waist area that prevented you from getting any closer. My brother started yelling at the guy, singing to get off the stage, or at least play some Slayer. Even without amplification, my brother could be heard quite clearly. He rattled this guy good and pissed him off enough that he started flubbering his lines, which led to more ridicule from my brother. Then, inevitably, he tried to start a mosh pit. My brother loves mosh pits. I always avoided them, probably because the first time I ever saw one and ended up in one was at a Christian metal band festival I went to when I was a freshman in high school, and did not realize sandals were not the best attire for such events. Any excuse to hurt people was okay for my brother. We both, back then, were very angry. I just channeled my anger into a less overtly violent ways. My anger has been fully actualized for the emotion it truly is, which is sadness. It still tries to disguise itself as anger to me, but I'm wise to its ways now and have recognized it for what it truly is. I'm not sure my brother will ever understand this. After the second interrupted security guard cease and desist warning to stop trying to start a mosh pit by security, I did not need to be psyched to see what was coming. I knew he was making anyone within 30 feet of him nervous. Security started gathering forces. He was still yelling at the poor Eminem wannabe, and no one was daring to stop this insane, possessed Viking screaming at the rapper for, as he called it, being a wigger. My brother at that point just started banging his head to the silent metal that was always probably playing in his head as a muted background, and overshot his head thrust and banged his nose hard on the metal bar in front of him. He has a crow's feet scar on his nose from that moment. Me and my brother both share ridiculously high pain tolerance, and there has been many times we both are bleeding after injuries where we did not notice until we were practically slipping on the stuff. This was one of those times. Blood was just pouring down his face and onto his shirt, onto his gray wolf shirt. He looked like he was in some sort of medieval horror movie. This extended and exacerbated problems at the moment, but created a good barrier around him of others trying to avoid the blood he was slinging everywhere and on everything. I managed to get to him before security and plead my case that we needed to get out of there because trouble was coming. I got him to the front of the venue, and it was almost out of the building before he made a dash for the restroom. I could hear him outside screaming something about hell in the soul. Unlike my brother, my fundamentalist upbringing, I had tried to understand through studying other religions and philosophies and the occult, and of course hundreds of hours of talking to strangers and anyone who would listen, oftentimes just starting conversations with people asking if they believed in the esoteric concept of the soul and what it meant to them. To make sense of all this baloney, this is what I had done. My brother only confronted such issues of brainwashing and child abuse at inappropriate times, and it'll end a lot of times when he was really drunk. I saw the complete security team at the venue. All 7 of them went into the bathroom. I started to gather my force powers at that moment. I followed them into the bathroom and did my best to plead my case to them. I plead my case to the most in charge security guy in the group. I basically said to them I was their best chance at no one getting hurt and getting out of there without any incidents. I remember telling them that if there was a fight, if this was going to end up with a fight, one of them was going to get hurt. I guaranteed these security guards that somebody was going to lose an eyeball or lose a fucking ear by the time it was done if they didn't let me try to handle the situation. And it wasn't going to be good. And that would definitely happen. My brother's insane when he's drunk. He's a big guy. My brother's 6'2". Back then, he was lifting weights. He was probably 230 pounds of muscle. I mean, just built. Got sidetracked, sorry. I basically said to them that it was best choice no one get hurt and get in either without any incident. He was vacillating between screaming at himself in the mirror and laughing insanely while bleeding all over the sinking floor. Oh yeah, I did say that. I told them I could guarantee that one or more of them would end up losing an eyeball or ear or worse if they tried to physically remove him from the place. And what harm would come if they let me try. Just let me try to get him out of here. My logic rebelled and I was barely able to get him out of there before real violence ensued. After we got outside the Fox Theater, it started to finally dawn on me that it was graduation weekend, and that's why it was so nuts on the hill and everybody was in party mode. I also noticed the more than above police presence keeping the revelry in line. My brother was doing okay for the moment. Some pretty 20-year-old, probably psychology student, had become enthralled with him even in his bloodied state, and had taken pity on him and engaged him in conversation about the soul or whatever he was rattling on about. This was only to be a brief respite of the evening. Once the girl had moved on to more stable people in conversation, my brother was back to his angry shenanigans and was attracting attention that I knew would land us in jail if we were not careful. It also began to snow hard. One of the not as rare as you would think Colorado snowstorms that hit in late spring. I was trying to corral my brother away from the university area when he was screaming at cars and strangers on the street covered in blood. It became almost impossible. Ironically, it was my actions that ended us up in cuffs. We were trying to cross the street when this car, driven by some college guy, almost hit me. I was at my wit's end at this point and pissed off, so I went over and very dramatically feigned a punch into the driver's glass window, just to scare the kid for almost hitting me. I was also still a little drunk, but not as much as my brother, but definitely enough to make some bad decisions. My brother was also screaming at the driver at the front of the car. This is when we heard sirens of the cop car where the cop had observed both me and my brother's actions. We both were in cuffs a few minutes later, and I was up against a squad car. Had an 8-inch double-sided Dirk-style seal knife hidden in my waist the cop found. Now, if we had been in our birth town of San Diego, we surely would have been taken to jail and I would have been charged with some sort of concealing deadly weapon charge like I had been charged with years before when I was a minor. But I used the force. I used every bit of it I could muster to convince the cop that he had arrested us the same kind of logic I convinced the security guards inside also of. I told him I could get him home without incident. I would call a cab. We, me speaking for my brother, of course, were extremely sorry. I apologized for the knife. I even explained that my brother just found out today he was going to be a father card. I mentioned the possibility of mounds of paperwork that would be generated once he tried to get this drunk idiot brother of mine into a police car and later into a cell. I didn't know if this is what did it or the fact that it was almost 3 in the morning and probably getting close to the end of shift, but it worked. He let us go with a promise that I would call a cab and go straight home. I did not actually call a cab. We walked for several miles in this out of the blue snowstorm to a North Broadway where I was renting a small art studio in these warehouse-like industrial-looking connected buildings where you were not supposed to actually live, but everyone did that was some poor creative type. It had a sink and a toilet, and that was sufficient enough for me at the time. This would not be the last time my brother's drinking would cause me distress. In fact, one of his drunken nights a few years later would be arguably the worst day of my life and almost end up in our deaths. I guess I will write about that night, but let me preface this by saying it is hard. I still love my brother and wish things would have turned out much differently. I have many other memories that are much happier than the ones I'm writing about. Like one memory in particular I relish when we were both wee little kids living in Ordway, Colorado, playing in the mud during the summer out in the front yard, slinging and playing and fighting and having a grand old time before the worries of adulthood and life and religious programming. I remember us howling like hungry hyenas as our mother washed us off, completely covered in mud from head to toe, with the cold water from the hose before we could go inside. But those memories I have to seek out. They are not as vivid and as painful as life-altering as many of the memories I now have in association with me and my brother's connected past. And even as I write this, I struggle not to convince myself to forgive him one more time and try to recapture the thick as thieves feeling we had as young men. Those days are long gone and cannot be revisited. The evidence of action versus ideas have finally convinced me that it would continue to be harmful and destructive to me to be around not only my brother, but also for other reasons just as important to my well-being, my parents also. It really sucks and hurts, but I know it is the way it must be. There are only so many times one can allow oneself to be harmed by those who are supposed to care and love you before it becomes a comfortable uncomfortableness that you just stay in because of its familiarity. This was 2011. I was living in Nederland, Colorado. I had pretty much a nice setup. I was living in a 2-story house on a reservoir that was Section 8 housing. I had convinced my Section 8 overlord to make an exception to me to live in that house that was normally set aside for families because I needed to live close to my brother, who at the time was also my legal conservator and controlled my Social Security disability money. Him controlling my money meant he gave it to me every month, no questions asked, and helped me smoke the weed and enjoy whatever else I wasted my money on that month. I lived in Section 8 housing, so my rent was based on my income, which on paper was only my Social Security check. So it was like $127 or something, dirt cheap. Plus, it was the good old days when Obama was president, and I was getting like $150 a month in food stamps too. And on top of that, I was renting my spare room to a local old drunk who went by the nickname Toasty. He was a pretty funny guy who looked literally like a yarn gnome. With his long gray beard, rusty hair, he was pretty short. Years before, when he was really drunk, he threw a bottle of beer while drunk into a crowd of people and ended up scarring some little kid's face unintentionally. A lot of small town mountain people had shunned him after that, and he pretty much became more of an alcoholic after that. I do not hold one's past mistakes against them to a point. I try not to hold one's past against them to a point. I sure would want my past to be used against me, although there is plenty there to use if one wanted to. Also, the $200 a month he gave me in rent helped too. I was not supposed to be renting out my spare room, so I basically was being paid to live in this house up in the mountains next to my brother in Nederland, Colorado on a reservoir. It was a pretty nice setup. I had helped open the first tattoo shop in that town called the Tungsten Trail Tattoo Shop, and was apprenticing under Billy Lang, aka Billy the Kid. I was just getting my sea legs with the whole tattooing thing, and will write several chapters later about apprenticing under this guy Billy. I was walking home from the day of shadowing and watching and cleaning and being the shop bitch. I almost made it to my house when my brother's wife, who was waiting for me, stopped me from getting to my place and asked me for help. It was in regards to my brother. He had drunk 240s of malt liquor with crazy ex-con Robert from LA. Yes, there's a story there too. I shadowed that guy for a week before I realized he was the type to get someone shot. Robert had left, but now my brother was in town drinking, and his wife wanted me to babysit him because she was worried what would happen. I should have just gone home and stayed there. I did go home to drop off my bag and went to track down my brother. Back then in Nederland, there were 4 places you could drink alcohol. Nederland is a very small mountain town about 30 minutes from Boulder County, going up a very windy canyon road. It is almost 3,000 feet higher than Boulder, and from my opinion, seemed to attract a lot of people trying not to be on the radar in general back then. But even back then, in 2011, you could feel the winds of gentrification blowing hard even at these altitudes. The town was probably less than 1,500 people who lived in city limits, with more in the outskirting areas. There was the typical assortment of staples for a town this size: post office, grocery store, a pizza place, pizza place that served beer on the second level of the plaza that housed the grocery store and a video store too. The second level is where I worked as an apprentice for Billy. The summers were nice and 10 degrees cooler than down and below in Boulder, and bikers came in bundles during the fall when the trees changed. The winters were rough. One of the first winters I stayed there was a blizzard and it snowed over 8 feet and the whole town shut down and power went off. The grocery store gave away meals and meat, but the bar stayed open because taps do not require power, and half the economy was a weird black market of weed instead of paper currency anyways. Marijuana was pretty much already legal there way before the state weighed in on it because the cops just did not care. Probably because they were in on the profits or high themselves. I have no love for these mountain police for good reasons you will see. There was more than one time I would be out drinking and some hippie girl or guy would offer me cocaine or mushrooms. I did not do hallucinogens anymore. My last trip of mushrooms was in 2002, right before I left San Diego, and it was, as I would summarize it, a death trip where I almost blacked out after getting tunnel vision in a small narrow bathroom and banging my head on a sink. I spent the rest of the night in a fetal position thinking I had given myself a fatal head injury, contemplating all the mistakes I had made and people I had hurt, and wishing I would not be judged so harshly if I was about to actually die. I convinced myself I could hear the reptilian mechanistic gears that were running in the undercurrent of the city I probably lived in. Probably just because I was reading too much Grant Morrison and Robert Anton Wilson at the time. I did this in a room for 6 hours while my brother and his trailer park circus friends played heavy metal, gallivanted around, and played ridiculous loud music, and did a lot of the other drugs besides mushrooms. It was a weekend my parents took off, which was super rare, so me and my brother did not miss the opportunity. By the end of the night, my brother was literally smashing furniture and screaming that he wanted to play Scrabble for blood while doing so. So I have not been so quick to do hallucinogenic drugs again. It seems only 1 out of the 5 trips were not hellacious death nightmares. Only 8 to 10 hours of eternity would release me from. I definitely prayed to God more than once while tripping my balls off just to get me to the morning. I swore I would write my life and stop doing drugs and be good. Only betray my promise 4 or 5 months later because the first time I did LSD was so amazing and beautiful and made my brain feel like it had everything all figured out, or that nothing I had figured out both simultaneously were able to be believed and disbelieved at the same time. At this paradox was the heart of all reality, and we were broken pieces of a mirror of God that could only see itself once it was broken. I never was able to capture that first trip again, no matter how many times or different avenues of these classes of drugs I took. So I tracked my brother down at one of the outdoor patios. He was definitely drunk, but still at only level 1 asshole drunk. Slightly funny and only a little scary. We had levels of drunkenness. I myself go from super silly happy drunk to a morose, depressed, suicidal drunk somewhere between my 9th and 12th drink, depending on the strength. I did this night to drink, but was also mindful of the bombastic nature and potential of my brother's level of drinking. This night, like others, whenever my brother would leave his beer unguarded, I would try to dump it out, replace it with an almost empty bottle, so he would consume less. But both me and my brother have definite impulses and control issues once we reach a certain level of drinking, and we will drink anything in sight, including others' drinks in the bars if they're not being watched. We both were disrespectful jerks in this way, and when we were drunk, did not care what other people thought because we felt like gods. At night, as the night carried on, things got more dangerous and weird. It was late when I met my brother, and he was already 80 ounces plus whatever he had drank before I sat down with him. The town of Netherland was not good for me in many ways, or my brother, especially our livers. I definitely vowed more than once never to drink again after way too many margaritas, or at least no more tequila. Promises, promises. There are 3 bars in downtown Netherland, in the 2 street downtown of Netherland, all within walking distance of each other. Most nights, people would bounce around all 3 looking for some most happening one or the one with live music. We ended up at some point at all 3. As the night went on, it was apparent to me that my brother was not going to be reined in. I just knew it was impossible. I had several warnings that evening from my intuition just to leave, walk away, go home. Just walk to your house right now. Do not worry about your brother. He's a big boy. He can take care of himself. I think maybe if I did go home, my life would have been drastically different in many ways. But who knows? I definitely have wasted too much time in life playing the what if game. At some point, we ended outside of the Pioneer Inn. There was one black guy in town named Theo, and we were talking to him. My brother said something that triggered Theo, and I did not hear exactly what my brother had said, but the reaction from Theo was unmistakable. He was offended. Then my brother went on some rant about how the Irish were all slaves at one point, in only a way a white privileged person could do, trying in his awkward way to relate to Theo. I felt bad for both parties in this conversation and tried to stay like Italy in World War II. He also used the N-word at that point, and I told him I was not cool with that because to not be associated with him if he was going to be using that kind of language. After all, I shaved my head completely bald weekly and did not want any chance of being connected to or thought of as a racist just because my appearance was easily mistaken sometimes as one anyway. I could just feel it was going to get worse, and like a good guy in one of those old Western movies tied to a train tracks, all I could do was stare at the oncoming train and fiddle with my ropes hopelessly. It was weird being the older brother. Even as an adult, I still felt this sense of obligation towards my brother and family in general. I still had not entirely figured out that loyalty and the love I felt towards my family was never truly reciprocated in healthy, positive ways for the most part. I still struggle with these issues, and on a lot of levels, but definitely have allowed myself to now walk away completely and not look back like Lot leaving Sodom. I remember one distinct moment there when I was looking at the liquor license at the wall in the Pioneer Inn. I decided to memorize it so I'd be able to repeat it the next day as a way to prove myself I was not drunk. I had stopped drinking a few hours before and was just there out of fear that my brother was going to get in some sort of trouble. I had witnessed several times in the last few months my brother drinking to excess and doing incredibly stupid things that frightened his wife and children and myself. One time he decided just to headbutt and charge like a bull all the furniture in the house, destroying the chairs and couch in the living room. Another time he permanently modified his head by hitting repeatedly with a large mag flashlight when he was drunk. He still has a large lump to this day on his forehead from that night. My brother this night started to get grabby with the female at the bar, and she was not feeling it the way he was hoping. The second time he grabbed her ass, she was pretty vocal about not wanting him to do it. I honestly at this point expected him to be kicked out of the bar. But I have learned from previous experience of being around my brother in bars while everyone else is wanting him to leave and not be there anymore, that often people think if they just wait, he will leave. They do not know how he works. For example, about 2 years before, my brother came down from the mountains to hang out with me at my apartment in Boulder where I was living. We started drinking at my place. He wanted to continue to drink at the Pearl Street Pub, and I agreed, but he would not be allowed to wear my replica Magneto helmet from X-Men 2 like he wanted, and I also made him leave the hammer in the snow once I realized he had brought a hammer with him. That night, he smashed the mirror in the bathroom for fun with his fist and literally climbed a wall to sit on top of a mounted buffalo head that was luckily very well mounted to the wall. I suspect this was probably not the first time, but it usually was probably a person of much more significant smaller stature. Security was savvy that night and just waited for him to go out to the street to smoke a cigarette and just had 2 giants block his reentry. It was not always bad hanging out with my brother, and I'm not painting an entirely clear picture of him at the moment. More just trying to convince myself how it's better if I never have to be around him in person ever again, and that is okay. We spent more time just hanging and playing turn-based Dungeons and Dragons miniature games and collectible card games that I had taught him more than anything. I miss those days. My brother was a formidable strategic opponent before his proclivities turned his brain into mush. He did achieve a bachelor's degree in environmental ecology, so at one time he was not a complete dummy and had dreams, but he started having kids before completing his college aspirations, and instead of lifting his wife out of the gutter of her family and life previous to him, he allowed her over time to bring him down to her level instead. It is actually really sad to see my brother fallen so far over the last 2 decades. And just like you don't blame a dog for licking its own ass, I don't blame his wife completely for who she is, but definitely did not help. Back to one of the worst nights ever. My brother Travis started to heckle the band. I knew this was bad. There were 5 of these guys, and my brother was yelling at them to play some Black Sabbath. There was 5 of these guys, and my brother yelling at them to play some Black Sabbath was not going to suddenly make them switch from the bluegrass set to heavy metal no matter how hard he tried. He was getting downright scary and had reached the final level of drunkenness, which was his subconscious self-hate that was manifesting in a conscious way to make his mouth say things that would get people to want to hurt him so he could feel justified in his self-hate and anger that was so buried deep inside that he could not even recognize it. I shared this sometimes. The band was getting increasingly angry with him, and he had, at this point, was just openly mocking them, saying they sucked and sounded like shit. Fortunately, the bar sounded the last car and proceeded to kick everyone out. We and the other 4 patrons were shown to the door. My brother was smoking a cigarette. I felt a little relieved and figured the worst was over because we had made it to almost 2 a.m. and without a serious incident. I walked away from my brother because a girl I was semi-dating named Danielle was smoking about 20 feet from the big heavy wooden door of the Pioneer Inn. I heard in the background my brother started to chat, one more beer, one more beer, one more beer. Everything after this was very slow and very fast all at once. I did not notice but heard my brother start to beat on the wooden door with his closed fist while screaming, one more beer, one more beer. Me and Danielle continued to talk. I did not think much at the moment of my brother's actions. Even though the intensity increased and was loud, I figured the bar was closed and no one cared. I knew my brother much better than anyone around and knew he was pretty much harmless unless certain things happened. I knew he had no intention of actually breaking the door. It was just being a general jackass. My back was to him, and as I was talking to Daniel, who was facing his direction, I heard the side door open in the alley, and a commotion I saw from my peripheral vision. There was something going on. When I turned and saw the 7 guys, 5 guys from the band, and the owner and bartender surrounding my brother, I knew it was bad. I did not even hesitate for a second once I realized 3 of them were holding him from behind. The others were taking turns, inflicting various punishments to his head and stomach. I ran right towards them and screamed to get the fuck off him, which resulted in the 4 that were punching him directing their wrath at me. Shirts were pulled and punches thrown, which I dodged. I had gotten about 6 hours of tattoo work done on my skull that day, so I was trying hard not to get my fresh ink damaged in the melee. I also had a rather large knife on me and knew I could have easily produced it quickly and killed at least 3 of them before there were consequences, but I also knew the bartender had a shotgun, and if I produced any weapon, it would likely escalate and we would get really hurt or dead. And my goal wasn't to win this fight. My goal was only to get my brother and me home safely, to safety. That pretty much was my only goal since before the sun went down. The 3 of the 4 guys that engaged me had gotten behind me, and one had gotten his arm around my neck and pulled me to the ground. I was not quick enough to prevent the other 2 from positioning themselves further to hold me to the ground with their boots on my shoulders. I had one guy on each shoulder using his body weight and boots to pin me to the ground, and a guy from behind me using his arms and upper body to push me down on my head from the top and from behind to keep me pinned on the ground. The 4th guy was furious. He was screaming, "I'm going to kill you, motherfucker," over and over. "I'm going to kill you, motherfucker." I'm kind of an ill-like in the way that I flow, and not once did he actually punch or hit me in the face during all of this, but I was held to the ground. This 4th guy began to raise his foot and bring it down on my throat while the other 3 held me in place. I had quit smoking 3 years earlier when I lived in Boulder, and the only thing I knew to do to combat the urge to smoke was to join the YMCA and start to try to get in shape. I've never been a guy who was into sports, and by no means am a jock or weightlifter, but I do attribute my survival of this night to the many hours I had spent lifting weights at the YMCA of Boulder. 3 times this guy tried to bring his foot down in full force on my neck. Right here. 3 times this guy tried to bring his foot down in force on my neck, and 3 times I mustered every bit of strength to use my upper body and chest to thrust upward and destabilize the feet and arms pinning me down so I could slightly shift just a little bit to avoid this intentional foot to my throat. I was screaming to Danielle to call the police because these guys were trying to kill us. She screamed back that she did several minutes ago. The irony was we could literally see the police station from where we stood across the street, across the other side of the stream that ran behind the main street. The police could have walked from the station to the PI in a few minutes. This whole thing took about 10 minutes. The cops could have walked from the station over to the PI and back a dozen times while this went on. The 3rd time I used my upper body to buckle, I was successful in raising myself off the ground and knocking the guys trying to hold me down off of me enough to avoid the foot being aimed at my throat, and I was able to get up off the ground. I saw the other 3 guys had succeeded in pinning my brother up against the car again on the streets and were still beating him silly. He, unlike me, did not avoid such punches directed at his face. In a sort of masochistic way, seemed actually like he was swerving to embrace each punch as much as possible. He was way too drunk to actually fight back. Now comes the mystical part of how I got us home that night, without death taking us to our forever home in the dirt. Once I got to my feet, I ran towards the 3 guys working my brother over. The 4 guys on me clawed at me from behind, trying to stop me from proceeding. I had been for years collecting amber necklaces and wore them almost every day. I was inspired by the actor Michael Duncan in the movie The Scorpion King that came out in 2002. He wore giant chunky necklaces, and I thought it looked awesome. A lot of my style had been influenced greatly by movies. I figured if he could rock these giant necklaces, then so could I. And I began to collect amber and copal and other beads that looked to me like bottled sunshine. I also studied Wicca and read that if you added jet beads to amber necklaces, it made a traditional Wiccan necklace that was a very protective barrier and circle around you, and that could protect you from negative intentions. These guys from behind clawed and ripped off my 5 strands of amber I was wearing, and all the beads tumbled to the ground like a rain falling from the sky. The 4 guys chasing tumbled to the ground like rain falling from the sky. The 4 guys chasing all were not able to avoid these very oily, slick marble-like beads, and all of them faltered and slipped and could not catch me as I single-mindedly raced towards my brother, with no other mission other than to get him away from the 3 guys turning his head to mush. I busted in like a bowling ball and literally grabbed my brother and ripped him away. I pulled him and ran at the same time to the bridge that was at the end of the street and connected to the street where we lived, and ran us down to the bushes and shrubs that ran next to the stream and could conceal our path home completely unseen. It was some kind of miracle. By the time I got my brother back to the house, maybe that should be it for now. I think I'm going to call that part 1, and I'll read the rest of the story if you're interested. If you get this far in the video and you actually are liking the story, let me know, because this is a 60-page story. It's very hard for me to read. It's emotional. I'm only 28 pages into 58, so I have 30 more pages of this that I would like to read, but I'm going to save it for part 2. And if anybody actually enjoyed this and wants to hear more of my stories, I got buckets of stories. I got so many stories, it's hard for me to write them because they bring out so much pain to me, the memories of my life. I've had a rough life. You know, this last year has been really rough. I basically lost my whole family because of COVID in a weird way. They're not dead, they didn't die, but I won't talk to them anymore. They don't respect me. They don't love me. They do, but they don't know how to. They only know how to love improperly, and they taught me a lot of ways to love improperly. And because of my family, I still suffer every day, and always will, because I love them and I miss them, but I can't deal with them. So, anyways, that's the end of part 1. That's the worst. That's the worst day of my life. I have one other day that's close, but not. I have one other day where I almost died too. That's pretty shitty too. I don't know which one's worse, but I'll tell that story another day. But this was Pyre Wizard Dragon for YouTube. I got half my story read. I'm gonna share this on YouTube, and I'll probably just put part 2. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if I get any actual response, if anybody actually makes it an hour and listen to me. It's a true story though. Thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful day. Bye.